In the interest of time, I'm probably going to get started. We have an hour. That's the crash course in this topic, so I'm not expecting to make anybody an expert by the time we walk out. But I know that there has been a lot of talk in this community about human trafficking and how it is presenting itself, and more service providers are coming in contact with trafficking victims. And the healthcare arena is kind of, I don't want to say late to the game, but it is one of these kind of undiscovered areas of point of contact with human trafficking survivors. So it's really important for people to know the signs, know what they're looking for, and be able to identify these victims and kind of put them in contact with services to help them get what they need. I say that as, with a grain of salt, because we know there are not enough services for trafficking victims anywhere in the state, let alone, outside of maybe Madison and Milwaukee. I am from this community. I'm from the Stevens Point area. I understand that there aren't as many resources up here, so this is, something that's still evolving. We are a small group today. We've only got an hour, but feel free to raise your hand if you have questions as we go. I'm going to hope that there's some time at the end for questions. I don't know if you all need to run away at 11, but I'm happy to stay and take questions afterwards if people have them and you have the availability. A couple things to note about my contact information. I used to be at End Domestic Abuse Wisconsin. My name's Morgan Young. I suppose I should introduce myself. And I was formerly the immigration and poverty attorney at the State Domestic Violence Coalition, End Domestic Abuse. It used to be called WCADV. But I have recently, as of last week, gone over to the Department of Justice, working in the Office of Crime Victim Services. Kind of coordinating the trainings and doing a lot of that kind of stuff for all different victim service providers throughout the state. Please feel free to contact me whenever you might have questions down the road. I don't have any cards because I'm brand new, but that is my contact information, and I am happy to field questions or put you in touch with other people in the community. I've been working with folks in this community for a long time on the issue around trafficking, so there are definitely resources up here that you can be in touch with if you had any interest in getting more involved or questions about maybe someone that you've run into. This is kind of the crash course. We're going to talk about red flags that might present themselves in patients. We're going to gain an understanding about what trafficking looks like in Wisconsin. I hear a lot, it's not happening here, whether that's in Milwaukee, which it's obviously happening, or that's up here. So we're going to talk about what it really looks like. And a lot of people are focusing on sex trafficking. I'm also going to talk a little bit about labor trafficking because that's very common in this area specifically. And we're going to talk a little bit about what kind of resources and tools are available to you as future healthcare service providers when you're working with individuals that might need some of these resources. So just to kind of get everybody on the same page, we have some statistics because, this is something that we're trying to get more data around and we're still falling behind. But there's an estimated 20.9 million victims of trafficking in the world today. 68% of them are in forced labor, so that would be non-sex work according to this definition, even though I don't necessarily agree with that definition. 26% are children. So this is really an issue affecting children very specifically, and 55% are women and girls. However you are most vulnerable, those are the people that traffickers are going to be most drawn to trying to recruit. So we're talking mostly women and girls. But there has been a big movement to traffic trans youth. So youth that are, otherwise vulnerable or victimized in their community are going to be ripe for the picking for traffickers as well. But we're looking a lot at women and girls. The International Labor Organization estimates that forced labor and human trafficking is a $150 billion industry worldwide. So why does trafficking exist? Because it's incredibly profitable, and we'll talk about how that breaks down a little bit. The U.S. Department of Labor has identified 136 goods from 74 countries that are made specifically by forced and child labor. So the big joke is always iPhones. How do you get really tiny pieces of electronics put together with really tiny fingers? And any kind of garment you have that has beadwork on it is probably sewn by child forced labor. And not to be, the buzzkill on a Monday morning, but it is really important to know where your products come from. And besides the whole buy stuff made in the USA because we want to support jobs here, you want to buy stuff from places with stricter labor laws, essentially. So that's something to keep in mind. In 2014, an estimated 1 out of 6 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were likely child sex trafficking victims. So when we talk about who these kids are, who are the kids being recruited as sex workers, the average age into prostitution is 12 years old in our country. 12, those are kids. You can't consent to have sex legally at 12. You can't consent to sell sex either. These are kids that are runaways or throwaways, they're considered. There's something else bad happening in their lives that we're going to talk about, why they are so vulnerable and why they're getting picked up. And of those kids, 68% were in the care of social services or the foster care system when they ran away. So the numbers are staggering, that the number of kids that are in the foster care system that end up being commercially sexually exploited, which is what we call sex trafficking of minors, is huge. It's through the roof. It's around 70%. So we know that these kids are the most vulnerable, and that's kind of one of the areas we need to be paying more attention. So we talk about the money. After drug dealing, human trafficking is tied with the illegal arms trade as the second largest criminal enterprise in the world, and it's the fastest growing. And there are a couple reasons. You can sell drugs only so many times before they're consumed and they're gone. You can only sell guns so many times before they reach their destination. You can keep buying and selling people over and over again throughout their lifespan. So maybe someone is recruited into a trafficking situation for sex work when they're 12 or 14, and they're used for sex trafficking until maybe they're 30, maybe they're less desirable. You can still make money off of them doing other things after, they are no longer good for maybe their original purpose. And you can keep reselling those people. You can buy a child for as little as $50 some places, and an adult for a couple hundred. So there is so much money to be made here. And when we're talking about sex trafficking, that money just kind of exponentially grows for the pimp or the trafficker who's controlling that person. So for instance, if you have a woman or a girl and you're saying she has a $500 a night quota for turning tricks, for doing sex work, and you make her work the 7 days a week, these people aren't getting benefits, they don't get days off, that's one person making $3,500 tax-free a week. And they're not keeping this money. They have to give that to somebody else. If you have 3 women or girls, it's pretty average, in your stable, you are making $10,500 per week with those 3. So if you're one pimp or trafficker and you have those 3 working for you, you are clearing almost $600,000 a year. And these numbers aren't even high. $500 a night is not a high amount. You're clearing tax-free almost $600,000 a year. So for instance, if you know there are 80 pimps or traffickers in the Metro DC area, for instance, where the study was done, you're looking at $47 million in just that little pocket of industry. So there is so much money in this, which is why it's really hard to shut it down. So what are the dynamics? Why are people in these situations? Partly because trafficking is a hidden crime. You are not going to get a lot of people that are ever going to identify as being a trafficking victim, labor trafficking, sex trafficking, whatever. It's not something that people are going to acknowledge for you. I come from the domestic violence field, and some of you may have had information about domestic violence, experienced it personally. You know that people aren't usually lining up to say, yes, I'm a victim of domestic violence. Even less so when we're talking about trafficking, because we'll talk about the shame and the fear and the other dynamics that come into play. It's also really hard to identify because victims don't look like a certain thing and traffickers don't look like a certain thing. Victims are men, women, and children of every race, ethnicity, socioeconomic class, sexual orientation, nationality, and religion. But we know, again, the more vulnerable you are, the more likely you are to be trafficked. So the most vulnerable people are always going to be women and girls from impoverished areas. And we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between international and domestic trafficking. The commonality is that the traffickers, the pimps, the labor, providers, whoever you want to use the words for, are using force, fraud, and coercion to force these individuals to work for them. They don't have the right to leave. And they're controlled by violence or the threat of violence. And so oftentimes there's violence at the very beginning. It's a conditioning period. But after that, they don't even need to necessarily use violence to control somebody. It's that idea that it could happen that is strong enough to keep people staying where they are. So I talked about the climate of fear. There's a lot of fear element there, and that's what keeps the people doing what the traffickers want them to do. The fear of placing their family or themselves in danger, you know, I'm going to go hurt your mom or your sister or whomever else if you don't do what I say. It's very, very common for traffickers to impregnate the girls working for them, and then they have a child in common to control them with. So I'm going to turn your child out. I'm going to start, you know, tricking out your daughter. You're never going to see her again. And unfortunately, even when people are able to leave their trafficking situation, if they have a child in common with their trafficker, now they have a family law action for the rest of this child's minor years with this person who's horribly victimized them. And our laws don't really provide any protections for them. So they have the fear of losing their family or their children, which is a very legitimate fear. They have complete economic dependence on the person that is selling them, because this is the person paying for their food, paying for their place to stay, giving them clothes. They might be raking in, you know, $500 to $1,000 a night. They turn over every single dollar. They can't leave and have any money with them. It's not like they can stockpile the money to make a clean break. They are accounting for every dime they earn. They have emotional dependence. This is the person who's also taking care of them. And we're going to watch a little bit of a video that might give a better explanation for this. But these people aren't the bad guys to the victims. They're the bad guys to us that look at the situation and say, this is really messed up. But these are people that have gained the trust of their victims. Oftentimes, especially when we're talking about the girls that are recruited into sex trafficking when they're 12, 14 years old, they would identify that person as their boyfriend. They just think, you know, their boyfriend needs them to make a little money. This isn't someone that's doing bad things to them. This is someone that loves them and cares about them when maybe nobody else does. So it's really hard to kind of break through that mindset to try to offer services. There might be cultural or religious constraints. Oftentimes we see this particularly when we're talking about the sex trafficking, because these girls weren't recruited to turn tricks. They weren't recruited to, you know, have sex for money. That's no little girl's dream. They were told maybe that they were going to be a dancer, or they were going to be a model, or they were going to, you know, work in a club, but they didn't have to take their clothes off. And then when they're forced to do something that maybe goes against everything that their cultural and religious guidelines say, that's too shameful for them to acknowledge. They don't think they're going to be accepted back into their community. They have a fear of law enforcement, whether they are immigrants who maybe don't have documentation, or they are domestic sex workers or labor workers. They are breaking laws frequently, so they're prostituting themselves. Or if it's labor trafficking, it's very common for the trafficker to make somebody shoplift or something else to hold over their head to say, if you don't do what I want you to do, I'm calling the cops and they're going to arrest you. And then what's going to happen? Then what are you going to do? So this fear of law enforcement is very legitimate, because there's a lot of misunderstanding with law enforcement about, you know, who a victim is versus who a criminal is. Obviously, there's guilt and stigma. These people feel tricked. They got tricked into doing something that they didn't think they were going to be doing. It's very shameful to find yourself in this situation with no control, to be, you know, completely minimized as a human, especially when it's sex work. These victims are told they're nothing but whores. No one's going to love them. They're just dirty sluts. And they don't have any reason to think that that's not true. Or maybe they think that the abuse is going to change, that maybe that if they do just make a little more money, then they don't have to do this anymore. Because that's often what they're told by the trafficker at the beginning. Hey, we're a little behind on rent. If you could just, you know, go do a little work for a couple nights, we're going to get a little money and then it'll be okay. They think that if they just did something a little bit better, then the situation might change. We also see a lot of people being ambivalent over making the change. And a lot of times this comes when there is drug use involved. One of the easiest ways to control somebody is to get them hooked on an illicit substance. So we see a lot of times that the trafficker has gotten them hooked on heroin or cocaine or something, and it's, if you come home, once you make your $1,200, I'll give you a bump, I'll give you a hit. So now this person is also their drug supplier, and if they are medicated just to the point of being able to function, maybe they're ambivalent over making that change. They're just worried about their next fix. They definitely don't have resources. That's kind of how they're in the situation that they're in the first place. And when we're talking about undocumented immigrants, they might not have their documentation or their legal status. Or if they do, all their paperwork's been taken away from them. So if they were able to get away from their trafficker, they can't prove who they are to anybody. And they're worried, you know, that they don't have any valid ability to stay here. And we'll talk a little bit about that too. So who's seen a power and control wheel before? Besides you, Danita. Okay, most of you. So obviously in the domestic violence world, we love the wheel. The wheels, you know, are illustration for everything. But it is also appropriate to look at the context of power and control when we're talking about human trafficking. So it looks similar to what we're looking at with domestic violence, but we use children, we use emotional abuse, we use intimidation, isolation, threats, and economic abuse. Outside of maybe the physical and sexual violence people are experiencing. There are all these different facets where you're really just controlling someone else, exerting that power over them. But because we're also making money off of them, there's really the issue of poverty and deception. So we're talking about exploiting the feminization of poverty. Why are women and children most vulnerable? Because poverty is a feminist issue as well. Using the children to make money off of, minimizing, denying, and blaming. Male privilege and crime. So sometimes there's organized crime. Sometimes, you know, there's an element that really goes with the male privilege and the strip club thing. Emotional coercion and using deception. Again, people are not being told, hey, you're going to go turn tricks for money. They are told there is something better to do. You're going to be a nanny, you're going to be a maid, you're going to work in the salon, you're going to do all these things. They don't know that they're going to end up doing something else, or they're not going to be allowed to leave the situation that they've, you know, been put in. And a lot of times these children are being recruited with their parents' knowledge, because the parents are told, hey, we can get your child into the US, we can get them in a good school, they can send money home, this is a great scenario. Well, once, you know, they're gone, they're gone. But parents are also not just giving away their children necessarily. They really think they're making a choice that's better for everybody. So we talked a little bit about immigrant victims. Immigrant victims are kind of like the tip of the iceberg when we're talking about the numbers we're dealing with. They are a small fraction of trafficking victims, both in Wisconsin and in the country. By far, the majority of trafficking victims are US citizens, and they look like us. Or if they're in Milwaukee, they look like young black girls. But they are not necessarily just immigrant victims. I will preface all this by saying, up here you do have a lot of immigrant labor victims working on the farms and in the canneries and, you know, the factories. So that's probably an area in this specific community where you see more immigrants than statistically normal. But we do have this additional barrier when we're talking about immigrant victims. Not necessarily knowing the language, having the same fear of law enforcement, but expedited tenfold because of the fear of deportation. Not knowing what rights they have, and we'll talk about immigrants do have specific rights if they are trafficking victims, but who's going to tell them that? How do they know that? They don't know that there might be available services that they can get in the community. They don't know that they can access health care. And there might be cultural considerations that make it too shameful, even if they did know where the resources are, that they don't want anyone to know what happened to them. I worked with a woman who was from the Philippines, and she had been recruited basically as a mail order bride, very common, and she became a sex slave when she got here. She was from the Philippines. This was in northern Wisconsin, outside of Superior, so even more rural. Obviously, when people are recruited from other countries and they said they're coming to the US, no one really thinks they're going to like rural Wisconsin, because that's not what they see in the movies and on TV. Like, they have this other idea of what's ahead of them. But she came here, she married this gentleman, and she was a little bit older, but she was supposed to be providing for her family back in her rural village. And he basically locked her in the basement and used her as a sex slave and brought in other people and charged money for visits with her. And when she finally broke out, was working with a program, the program I was working with, I assumed she'd want to go back to her family in the Philippines. She had no support system. She had no family and friends. I mean, the closest even cultural community was the Twin Cities. And she was adamant. She had no interest in returning to the Philippines because she would only bring shame on her family. If they knew what had happened to her, there would be this great shame brought upon her family, and it wasn't worth it to her. And that's not uncommon. So it's really important to remember that lots of times people don't want what seems like the most obvious resource or scenario for them, because that's actually a worse outcome. So they're more interested in making a life here, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So we do have additional layers of issues when we're talking about immigrant victims, and you would be potentially seeing some of these folks. We also see a lot of increased risk factors working with Native Americans. There has been very well documented studies. The one I'm using these from are the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center. They did a study where they essentially bribed people to come in and take a short survey. I think they gave them gas cards or grocery cards, and they found really consistent narratives of these people's lives. There is extreme family poverty. We know that the poverty rates are much higher in Native American communities, whether on or off the reservation. There are much higher rates of runaway and homelessness, especially in youth. There is a lot of gang influence in peer and their family circles. The gang element is very much alive and well. There is a strong history, both just culturally and specifically, of physical and sexual victimization. And we'll talk about why that's really important. There might be parent or guardian addiction. We know there are really high rates of AODA abuse in the population. If you don't have a functional parent, it's really hard to have that support system at home. There might be female relatives or friends already engaged in prostitution. And in fact, I was at a training once where a woman was relating her story, and she had said that, you know, she started having sex when she was 15 or 16, and her father said to her, well, if you're having sex anyway, you should probably be making some money. You should consider, you know, going to this club where I know that people would pay you. And she was told that as a child by her father. So, I mean, we see that there's this theme, and it's not just in the Native population, but that is a commonality that is shared. There might be fewer any ties to cultural support. You know, there has been a lot of degradation of the cultural communities in Native American populations over the decades and centuries. So there might not be that tie to the cultural support. We talked about drug or alcohol use, and there's much lower workforce skills and a much higher school dropout rate in the population. So that is why Native girls particularly are incredibly vulnerable. And there have actually been a couple pimps that have been caught and sitting in prison who have said, a Native American girl was my ideal. Any ideas why, besides these factors? I mean, this is really gross. Any ideas? He said that Native girls often look generically ethnic, so you can dress them up and kind of tell whatever story you want. You have a John that wants a little Mexican girl. Hey, guess what? She's actually Mexican. Oh, they want a Native girl? Oh, she's Native. Because they're brown, and they can just kind of create whatever story for them they want. So they can sell them at much higher prices for people with fetishes. So we had pimps that said, these are the girls that we're looking for. And when you have all these other factors in place, it makes them kind of prime pickings for these predators. I'm full of sunshine today on a Monday morning. Sorry, everybody. So trafficking has a lot of overlaps with other forms of violence, which is kind of how I came to be doing this work. I talked a little bit about the domestic violence, and I showed you the power and control wheel. But there are a lot of commonalities besides just the power and control. There is a lot of physical and sexual violence, and that includes labor trafficking. So there are some statistics that say that there is a sexual assault rate for labor trafficking victims, and this includes men, women, and children, of 70%. So 70% of people that are labor trafficked are also sexually assaulted. And that's even more damaging when they're men, because then there's the additional guilt and stigma. It's not about sex, it's about power and control. So we do see really high rates of physical and sexual violence across the boards for trafficking victims. There's still the isolation and the restricted movement. How do you control someone? You keep them close and you don't give them access to other people. There are obviously the threats of harm, the degradation and name calling. You're stripping this person's humanity away from them. Control of immigration documents and finances, like I mentioned, very common with domestic violence as well. And threats to abuse the legal process. So whether that's, I'm gonna get you arrested, I'm gonna get you deported, I'm gonna take away your kids and you're never gonna see them again. No one would let a slut keep her kids. I mean, you work the track. How on earth would anyone let you keep your kids? You're a horrible mother. That's a very common threat that they hear. And we talk about vulnerability again. So vulnerable individuals, including those who have already been victims of domestic violence, are going to be more susceptible to trafficking. The more trauma someone has endured, the more likely they are to be a victim. Because trafficking victims aren't running to these pimps or these traffickers. They're running away from something worse, often something that has occurred in their childhood, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So what we're specifically talking about is this kind of slippery slope between sexual abuse and then commercial sexual exploitation. So there are staggering statistics, which are on the next slide, about the rates of child sexual abuse and how frequently those kids end up being commercially sexually exploited. So we have child sexual abuse, and then we move to sexual exploitation of a child, which is more like kids having to trade sex for stuff, for a place to stay, for something to eat, maybe for drugs, to commercial sexual exploitation where someone is actually making money off of them. And we know that it all starts with this child sexual abuse. So there's already a linking of love and sex and abuse together. There's a violation of boundaries. There's this, not feeling like you own your body or you have control of your body. You're being viewed as a sexual object, so you start to internalize that. And we're talking about at a pretty young age. Obviously low self-esteem. Sometimes there's running away and homelessness. Then you have a need. You have now created a need, so you might need to have sex to get the stuff you need, whether that's food or shelter. When we talk to kids kind of in this middle area, the sexual exploitation, they'll never say that they're being sexually exploited. But if you ask kids questions like, have you ever had to do something to get something you needed, or because someone made you do something you didn't want to do? Then you get very different answers. So we sometimes call that sex for stuff, or survival sex. And then once you're there, it's really easy to just have someone start making money off of you. So this person that you've come to rely on now can turn you out and make you make money for them. And then it's a commercially sexually exploited child. So what are we talking about? There's been a lot of different studies with different rates. But essentially, there was a European study. They talked to women and girls ages 15 to 45 and found out that of those, 59% before they were trafficked were physically or sexually abused. 12% had had forced sexual abuse before they were 15. And then 95% were physically or sexually assaulted while they were being trafficked. Running away from home or the foster care placements is common and perhaps the most clearly linked early trauma with behavior that places the child at risk for subsequent abuse. So that's what I was talking about, that something like 70% of kids in the foster care system end up being commercially sexually exploited at some point. And why it's really hard to kind of break these kids or young women or adult women out of this mold is because we think of it kind of like Stockholm syndrome. There's this connection to the trafficker that they want to protect this person. Because when you're exposed to constant threat, seeming acts of kindness on the part of the abuser creates an emotional bond where the victim sees the abuser as the protector and then begins to sympathize and care for that person. And we call that a trauma bond. And even in this very small study, there was a clear 24% trauma bond. So I watch a lot of TV, like Criminal Minds and things like that, and you see this kind of behavior a lot, but it is very well documented. And in trafficking, it is very, very common. So these victims, whether they are kids or adults, the longer they've been in the life, it's called, the less likely they are going to be to accept any help, because they just want to get back to their pimp, who they will often call daddy, because that's not creepy or anything. They want to get back to their daddy because this is the person taking care of them. And this is the person that has told them that no one else is going to love them, no one else is going to take care of them. So it's really hard to say, but look, we can offer you all these services. They don't want that. They're just trying to get back to this person, which seems counterintuitive, but there's this trauma bond that's been created. So Breaking Free is an organization that provides direct services to trafficking victims, and they have created some really scary statistics that seem to be holding true in other studies as well. Of the people that come into this program, identified sex trafficking victims, 60 to 90% don't have safe housing. They don't have anywhere else to go. So if you say, hey, you don't have to live like this, and you turn them back out, they have to go back to their trafficker because they don't have anything else to do. 71% of the women had PTSD. 85% were victims of child sexual abuse, rape, or incest. So that kind of sets the precedent. 83% are victims of assault with a deadly weapon. So this is really high levels of physical violence. 75% were physically abused as children. 57% have been kidnapped. 95% are chemically dependent. So there's a lot of deprogramming that has to be done, but the substance abuse is going to be the biggest thing that has to be overcome right away, or they're not going to be able to get any of the other help they need. And over 90% have criminal records. So finding housing, finding employment, all these things is very, very difficult for people that are chemically dependent and have criminal records. So it is very hard. So this is kind of the same statistic. Another group found that 90% of people in the sex industry were sexually assaulted as children. 89% of the women in the sex industry said they wanted to escape but had no other ideas how they would survive. They didn't know how they'd make money. Women in the sex industry experience PTSD at rates equivalent to veterans of combat war. That's a lot of treatment ongoing that needs to be present to overcome these kinds of traumas. So I said we talk about labor trafficking a little bit because it is very common in this community. We have factories, agriculture, bars and clubs, hospitality, restaurant and food service, and domestic work. Those are kind of the major categories. So we're talking about farms, migrant camps, canneries, nail salons, massage parlors, strip clubs, escort services. And then in the service industry, which this is a bigger deal in like the Dells, hotels, restaurants, tourist enterprises. Is there any category that you see that's missing? Have you run into folks? What's tricky about this is a lot of the people that are working in these fields maybe are immigrants, and maybe they are perfectly fine with making less than minimum wage and getting paid under the table. That is not necessarily trafficking. And there's this really fuzzy gray area between like showing that someone is being exploited because they aren't getting the wages or the benefits that they deserve because maybe they're not documented, or that they're getting trafficked and that they can't leave the situation. Which is why we don't hear a lot about labor trafficking. It's something that the Labor Department kind of takes care of separately. We hear a lot more about sex trafficking because there's a lot more overlap for lots of, the service providers that we see. But it's still the force, fraud, or coercion. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So we know that undocumented immigrants are going to be particularly vulnerable. Maybe they came in with really short work visas, but they can then be coerced into other things because they are so susceptible on these short-term visas. Employers eventually really become they're keeping these workers in indentured servitude, so they don't give them their passports back. They don't give them their pay. They tell them they need to do this one more thing before they're going to get the money that they signed a contract that they have already earned. And we know that 70% of child labor takes place in the agricultural industry. And a lot of times it is kids working with their parents. So maybe parents are part of a migrant camp that moves around in the summer. They come through these areas. They have kids. Well, what are the kids going to do during the day? They might as well be out helping work in the field. So we see a lot of kids in agricultural industries as child labor victims. We know that 400,000 kids are working as migrant laborers in the United States each year. Obviously, child labor laws are probably not applying to them. Farm work is now listed as the second most hazardous occupation in the United States, with mining being the first. And if you're talking about people who aren't living in great work conditions and living conditions, maybe they're not healthy enough in the first place, there are a lot of physical side effects for that. So in the United States, nearly 300 children die and 24,000 are injured in farm work every year. So it's really dangerous too. Farm workers frequently face abuse and exploitative treatment, but not all exploitation is trafficking, like I said. We really need to look at when the employer is using force, fraud, or coercion to maintain this control. Can the person walk away from the job? That's the million-dollar question. And I gave you a brochure that can be folded as an actual brochure. Of course, it didn't copy correctly to do that, but you get the idea. That talks about what trafficking is, how to identify people, and then some questions. And the number one question is always going to be, can you leave your job or situation if you want? And for a lot of these people, the answer is going to be no, because they have been told they will be harmed, or their families will be harmed, or they will be reported to somebody. They don't have the ability to walk away. So what are we looking at in Wisconsin? So in Wisconsin, every year, the Polaris Project that maintains this national hotline, which the information will be on the last slide, puts together a list of the calls into the national hotline. They stopped making these pretty maps after 2013, but I can tell you that 2014, which is the latest one we have the statistics for, have more calls. Every year we get more calls, but the area they come from remains the same. So I want to say in 2014 we had about 260 calls to the hotline, so it keeps going up. But you can see the darker the spot, the more calls are coming from these areas. And again, think of this like the tip of the iceberg. These are just calls coming in. This is an unreported crime. So this is the few that are actually getting called in. Obviously, the urban hotspots are getting the calls. So Milwaukee's always going to be our biggest hub. And then we have, the Fox Valley and Madison and the Eau Claire area. But you can see right around you, pretty red. So it's definitely, hitting everywhere in Wisconsin. And one of the things we know is that, especially when we're talking about sex trafficking, people are being moved. People aren't just staying in their communities, they're being moved, and they're usually run on a circuit. I might even have a thing. They're run on a circuit from Milwaukee up to Green Bay, over somewhere in central Wisconsin, usually based out of Wausau, to Eau Claire, and then back down again. And these people are posted on Backpage, which is similar to what the Craigslist escort section used to be. And people set up dates. And oftentimes, these victims are so well trained and programmed that they are sent out alone without a pimp controlling them, because they wouldn't dare do anything but go around and make all their dates and come back with all their money. So that's why we also see some of these spots. I'd be really interested to see times of year where we see different things light up. Like, this is, hunting season, largely. I think it's really weird that there's nothing up here in Duluth and Superior, but then there is, if you just see the calls. The calls are just coming from Duluth. So this is Minnesota's map. Obviously, there's a huge amount around the Twin Cities, and this is a lot of agriculture as well. So people move. So just where the calls are coming from isn't really indicative of what's happening, but it's good to see that even though it looks like there's nothing up here in Wisconsin, obviously there's plenty happening. The Twin Ports up in Duluth and Superior are actually a huge source of international trafficking through the waterway, which I don't know how many people watch The Wire, the second season of The Wire with the docks. That's happening in Wisconsin. Obviously, Illinois is a huge source in the Chicago area. It's not uncommon for girls to be run back and forth from Milwaukee and Chicago or Madison and Chicago. We hear a lot of stories of girls getting picked up in cars on their way to one of these cities from one of the other, and they're told they were shoved in a car and told they had to go down to Chicago for the weekend to make some money. So we know that people are moving, and the bottom of our state is susceptible because of the trucking lines. So we know that there's a lot of trafficking around all these places where there's a lot of transportation. We also have the distinct honor of Milwaukee being known as the pimp capital of the United States. So people say, oh, trafficking isn't happening in Wisconsin. Oh, yes, it is. We have the pimp capital of the United States. So the last time I talked to the detectives that work special crimes in Milwaukee, they had 155 open cases. That is 155 specific traffickers. So who knows how many victims are underneath them. The pimps in Milwaukee have gone so far as to reappropriate the Milwaukee Brewers logo as a pimp sign. And so they take it and, oops, wrong button. And it is money over bitches. That's their insignia, and so you'll see a lot of pimps with the tattoo, obviously not in the Brewer colors, but it's become a thing, like it's an actual thing in Milwaukee. So as we talked about, they're running circuits from Milwaukee. It's not just staying in Milwaukee. It is, transversing the state. So what are we really here to talk about? How you, knowing all that depressing information, can actually work with victims, identify victims, get them in touch with the services they need. So I'm going to show you a quick video that gives you a little more information than just me talking about it.
I didn't have anywhere to go and I was scared and I needed someone to help me.
They prey on it. They prey on insecurities. My trust in people was really low. So I was sort of lured into running away with someone who turned out to be a sex trafficker, otherwise known as a pimp.
It's called a victimless crime, but the oldest profession is now being recognized for what it truly is: human sex trafficking. Hollywood may have sometimes made it appear glamorous, but the true images of sex trafficking are disturbing. Every day, children are lured into a hell with little hope or opportunity for rescue. until communities, policymakers, criminal justice professionals, and service providers band together with a renewed commitment to recognize prostitution for what it is: the trafficking of persons in sexual slavery.
If somebody was looking for it, you could tell that I had low self-esteem, that I was angry, and that I was rebellious. So he spotted me in the crowd and he called me over. And to me, at 14, that meant a lot, that he picked me out of my other friends because I felt like I wasn't as pretty as them. We exchanged numbers. It was pretty fast, and we just started talking on the phone.
I was placed in my aunt's home at the age of 4, and in her home I experienced sexual abuse, physical abuse. So I ran. Between the age of 12 and 16, I went through 42 different placements. At the age of 16, I called this childhood friend. She took me to the strip club and she introduced me to this guy. I told him how I was a runaway and I didn't have anywhere to go and I was scared and I needed someone to help me. And he looked me in my eyes and he said, well, you don't have to live like that.
I was in 23 foster care home, and I was adopted to a wonderful family when I was 12 years old. But because of prior sexual abuse and other things that happened in the child and family services, my trust on people was really low. I met a guy when I was 13 who was 15 years older than me, and I think he did what any pedophile would do. He tried to establish trust with me. Everything I've been through, he went through as well. Well, of course, as a child at 13, I believed what he was telling me about that. But the reality later is he actually never grew up in foster care. He never was adopted. He actually was from a background, a family of pimps.
When he finally got me to agree to run away, I think that he could pick up on my hesitation. So he bought me a pair of sneakers that was a big deal to me. And then he took me to a motel. This woman answers the door, and she looks like a model. She's really pretty. And so I think that's what she is. And we get inside, and he says to the girl to get her ready. Get her ready. And when he said that, I knew something was off. And he kind of glared at me, like daring me to say something. And I didn't say anything. I just didn't say anything.
Children, both boys and girls, who are victims of abuse, exploitation, or neglect are at the highest risk for becoming human sex trafficking victims.
My situation is no different from a lot of young women. You know, we come from homes sometimes where our father isn't there. And sometimes what happens is you find a friend or a friend finds you. It becomes that support. You know, becomes that father figure to you and loves you and wants to do anything for you. And you as a child, you're thinking that this person really cares. Little girls don't grow up to want to get blowjobs for money. That takes a tremendous amount of breaking down of someone's character and soul. And pimps are really good at doing that.
In order to understand this type of manipulation and abuse, training is critical for anyone who comes in contact with human sex trafficking victims.
Law enforcement who've been through training do a fabulous job of looking beneath the surface and trying to figure out whether the conduct is being made voluntarily or whether there's coercion going on.
We teach our detectives that you got one shot. And even though they don't talk to you, that does not mean you were not successful. Because she saw the way that you interacted with her, that you didn't belittle her, and the next time they'll talk to you a little more.
We have little cards with the hotline and our number, and we also say, I'm going to call you tomorrow to see how you're doing with whatever illness, under the guise of maintaining some contact. Training the staff, giving them an idea of what to look for, what could be possibilities, and knowing their resources.
Knowing what to look for requires understanding the subculture known as the game.
There's one maybe, and maybe 4 to 6, 70 girls. How would he be able to manage all these girls if it wasn't some sort of manipulations and beatings? Can't do all beatings. Got to be some other type of manipulation to keep your mind set. You must control them and give them a false sense of security that they have power that they don't have. So the power that he gave me at 14 was to become a bottom. Sometimes, I got to sleep in the bed with him. I collected the money, never kept any, gave it right back to him, made sure all the girls complied. They're smart because they make you recruit and then you get charged for it, and they don't. The other thing of being the bottom that the police and law enforcement didn't really understand, the bottom gets beat the most. It's really to break your whole spirit down. So if somebody's $1 short for essential, didn't do their job, fell asleep, too tired, you get beat for that. And then they make everybody watch you in a circle and they're not allowed to show any sort of emotion. If you cry, if you try to help, then you get beat a little bit more.
Prosecutors need to understand, get a hold of the game a little bit more like law enforcement does. And I think once we do, we can, take some significant steps forward.
Those steps include officers and prosecutors preparing for the challenges unique to trafficking victims.
We're seeing a lot of defense attorneys really get aggressive at attacking the victim, and they're trying to present a different type of picture. And sadly, it's a picture that I think a lot of our society still holds. We also will try and keep out drug abuse issues, runaway reports, and things that we really can argue are not relevant to the case.
The other thing I really protect and look for in the case is the evidence. And we're going to need that evidence to corroborate our victim story, as well as perhaps to go forward with the case even if we don't have the victim when we just take a stand.
Very seldom do we come across right away the trafficking victim that is a willing victim and is giving us all the information that we're looking for.
When I hear somebody say, I don't want to talk to you, you know what that means? I want to talk to you, okay? And so the more rage I see, the more anger I see, that actually, I got to tell you, brings a smile on my face. And that's what allows me to sit in a room and not be drawn into rage because it's a cry for help.
Moving beyond the rage requires a change in perspective on why victims stay in such horrific situations.
People always say, why did you stay, or why? You had a choice. In order to have a choice, you have to have options. To me, prostitution was not as bad as being molested.
The women that we see have no alternatives. Most of them got involved as teenagers. I honestly, after doing stings and seeing what goes on, I don't think anyone would choose
To do this, it was one point in my life where I felt so confident with my clothes off and on. It was at that point in my life where I just gave up on me. I didn't care.
One of my favorite things in the world to do is read. I love to read. It was like my way of going into somebody else's life. He never allowed us to read. He said, hoes don't need to read. The only thing you need to do is lay on your back. And I would get caught sometimes for it, but I still try little things to try to have kind of my own peace of mind, but still not thinking I was smart enough to do.
The only option is to find some grace from God to fall out of the sky and give them money to move across the country and start a new life. And these girls have that. They have nothing. They have a pair of high heels and a cell phone with like 20 minutes on phone.
Trafficking victims likely distrust authority and need a wide range of services and treatment. Collaboration is the key to solving this complex problem.
The frustrating part is oftentimes the inability to coordinate services for young people on the ground.
One of the successes we've had is to reach out to other partners outside of law enforcement. We've reached out to the faith-based community. We've reached out to the local university. You need to bring everybody in together, and it has to be a group response.
If you're going to convince a young victim to step out and have the courage to step forward and testify and do what needs to be done, they have to feel like there is a support mechanism there.
If you don't have anyone helping you, talking through this, trying to even be a support, it's years of trial and error.
Having service providers get involved even before the full formal interview of the victim can be a great asset. In fact, it furthers the goals of law enforcement. We're here to help you, whether you're here to help us or not. Because remember, these are people that have been used. That's what trafficking is all about.
It's been said evil flourishes when good people do nothing. We have the chance to do something, to bring success and change the future.
I'm proudest of those times, as far and few between as they may be, when a kid actually got out of this and they never went back to it.
Every decision I make from now on is up to me. I cannot blame my molesters, my pimp, my aunt, all these people I allowed to form my future. And I knew that I had to take control of them, and that's what I did, and I never looked back.
I don't blame myself anymore, that I don't have any regrets of anything that I've been through. I wouldn't change anything because it brought me to the experience at this point right now. It started to build the person who I am and bring me back to the faith I currently have.
Because I see women marketing their minds, not their bodies. I see them finding their passion and marketing that to the world instead of themselves. I see a movement being able to bring all these different creativities and talents together and really help other girls, because that's what it's about. It's about the next.
I truly believed at 14 years old that I was born to be a prostitute. Now, I was in the Gifted Talented programs. I was a smart kid, but because of all the things that happened to me, I thought that that's all I was worth doing, and that's all that I could be good at. And so it took a long time for me to finally realize my worth. I got out of it. And it's because of the people that helped me. It was all that support around me that allowed me to finally make that decision and start to work on myself. And I went to college and I got a degree in biology, 3.6 GPA. And today I'm a microbiologist. I promise you that it's not a lost cause.
So when they talk about the community and the community stepping in to help and early identification, that's you, that's healthcare providers, because you are going to be one of the only people who might be possibly running into these trafficking victims, because they need to be healthy enough to keep working. So their traffickers are going to make sure they are healthy enough to keep working at all costs. And that might mean you're the only people that they trust to help keep them, going. So we're going to talk a little bit, very quickly in the last couple minutes, about some victim identification. So as the video mentioned, they're going to be afraid to trust people offering help. They're feeling responsible for the trafficker, and they need to control something in their life. Their control has been taken away. They're going to be afraid to depend on anything that anyone says, because that's how they got in the situation they're in. So someone already offered them help, and that's then how they ended up being trafficked. They're not necessarily going to think they're victims. They're not going to want to admit they're victims. They might be unable to distinguish danger and chaos from fun and excitement, especially if there's some alcohol and drug addiction issues. And as such, they can't necessarily relax or have fun without chemicals. For identification, they might not know where they are. They might not have their ID. If they seem unhealthy, like malnourished, sleep deprived, dehydrated, that's very common for both sex and labor trafficking victims. They might not have a form of identification on them, or someone is speaking for them when they come in. So we always say, especially if this is someone presenting at a healthcare provider, who's with them in the waiting room? Who keeps trying to talk for them when they're there? Do they get to answer questions themselves? Or does someone jump in and say, oh, I can answer this better? Or if they don't speak English, I'll just tell you. And is this person pretending to be an uncle, a brother? They're probably not going to say they're a boyfriend. So who is this person and how are they interacting together? Do they seem submissive, or combative? Sometimes we see that. Are there old injuries that have been untreated that you discover? Do they have an inconsistent story of how whatever they're presenting with happened to them if it's an injury? Are there signs of physical, sexual, or emotional abuse or neglect that have been probably lingering for years? Is there an overdose or evidence of drug or alcohol misuse? When we're talking especially about sex trafficking, genital, bacterial, or yeast infections, wound infections, STIs, signs of pregnancies over the years, especially when this is a young person, very common that they would be repeatedly getting impregnated, whether they are forced to abort the child or they've actually carried these pregnancies to term. Like I mentioned, the third party insisting on being present. Obviously, you know best practice is to have these conversations with individuals alone. But if you have someone that's really pushing to be in the room or answer these questions, huge red flag. Is the victim or potential victim seeming anxious or fearful, especially do they seem fearful of the person they're with or the person who's maybe outside in the waiting room? Do they have tattoos? Like you saw in the video, the tattoos on the neck. It's very common in sex trafficking for victims to be branded by their pimps. It's often the pimp's name. Sometimes it's a $ in the pelvic region. I mean, it's very explicit branding. And do they have few or no personal possessions? Again, it's probably just, the clothes they came in with. These would all be red flags. They are probably going to be very uncooperative, perhaps the entire time you work with them, but definitely initially. So using a victim-centered approach is really important. What does she need? She might just need to take a nap. She might need something to eat. She might need some warmer clothes because she's wearing the clothes she was out on the street in the night before. What does she say she needs? She might not want to talk to law enforcement. She might not want to go to the shelter in town. She might want to just take a moment to relax in a safe place. Victims are going to need to feel safe before they're going to talk to you, and definitely before they're going to talk to law enforcement. Offering to call the police is probably not a good move. They are not going to trust you. They are not going to want to talk to someone. You need to be reliable and consistent and make it clear that you are an ongoing resource for them and that you can provide more information later or can always talk to them and answer their questions. You need to show understanding, patience, and respect for their dignity. Again, these are people that have had their humanity often stripped away from them. They've been told they're worthless. They don't need one more person judging them. They've got lots of that going on. Expressing sympathy for the victim and an interest in their well-being is fine. You can say, I'm worried about your health. I'm worried about your safety. You don't have to say, I'm worried that you're having sex with all these guys for money. No, you're worried about them as a healthcare provider, and that's why they trust you as the expert in your field, so that's how you're going to relate to them. But I would say honesty is really, really important, because when we're talking about underage girls, you have to report. This is child abuse and neglect. You are mandatory reporters of this child abuse and neglect if it presents to you. So you cannot promise to keep things confidential that you can't keep confidential. And you need to be very upfront about that, because you're trying to develop a trusting relationship with them so they have a resource. And if you hear their whole story and then are like, yeah, now I need to report this because you're a minor, you have just blown everything. They don't trust you at all. So you need to be very upfront. If someone maybe starts to make a disclosure, you say, I just need to tell you, I have to report things because you're a minor, and then you can talk about things maybe hypothetically and whatever else. You also can't promise anything you can't deliver, whether that is, I can keep this conversation confidential. If things come out, you might not be able to. I can promise you I can keep you safe. You definitely can't do that. So don't promise things you can't deliver to these victims. You need to assess their immediate safety concerns. Are they worried about going home with the person who's in the waiting room and they want you to call law enforcement? That would be kind of the best case scenario. Do you need to have an interpreter to actually have a communication with them that's meaningful? Avoid the language line if at all possible, and because we're in a small community, make sure that they're comfortable with any interpreter that shows up, because this might be someone in their community. This might be somebody they know. It might be a family member of theirs or the trafficker, so that's really important. Call in an advocate who might be able to work with this person. Again, you're not supposed to be the end-all be-all to these victims. You are supposed to be the healthcare provider, but you can work with the Family Center or other advocacy groups, CAP if you're from the Stevens Point area, people that can come and really kind of continue the conversation and connect them with other resources. Obviously, best practice, you're interviewing them alone, especially not with the person they came in with. It might be okay to have the advocate there, but you do not want the person who brought them in, no matter what that person looks like. As you heard in the video, the girl who was the bottom, it would very likely be the bottom or the bottom bitch if this is a sex trafficking situation. It's not going to be a man, it's going to be a woman who's going to seem like a concerned friend. She is probably there as the control person from the trafficker. So regardless of who it is and what story they're telling you, it's always best practice to talk to that person alone. You can make up an excuse to take them down for x-rays or run some tests and say, sorry, third parties aren't allowed in the room. Because the victim's probably going to say, yes, this person can stay, because that's what they have to say. So you can make up an excuse to get them alone to maybe ask them some additional questions. And there's some sample questions on this handout. Obviously, if they've been sexually assaulted, if you know that you have the protocol to work with a SANE nurse to do the forensic exam, ask for permission to do that. Obviously, screening for STDs and STIs if you think there's something going on. Ask the victim for his or her consent to contact law enforcement. This isn't something I said you should offer at least right away, but you're never going to contact if you can help it. Again, there are extraneous situations where you might have to. But especially if it's an adult, you want to make sure that they're comfortable with that before you do it. So I have one handout that looks like this wheel that really talks a lot about physiological and emotional impacts of child sexual abuse, and then CSEC, the commercial sexual exploitation. And it kind of runs through like all these things you see. So that's a good detailed guide. But in terms of health consequences, there are short-term and long-term health consequences that will present themselves. Obviously, there can be death, there are contusions, cuts, burns, broken bones, dehydration is very common, like I mentioned. Other physical injuries, bacterial infections, exposure to hot or cold. So maybe they are out working when it's 30 below and they're wearing their little skimpy outfits. If you see signs that they've been exposed to inappropriate temperature conditions. Cut or amputated limbs for people working in unsafe working conditions, very common. Obviously, we talked about the mental health a little bit with the PTSD and the Stockholm Syndrome, but suicidal ideation attempts, depression, anxiety, hostility, flashbacks, and re-experiencing, they're very easily triggered from this trauma. Sexual health, obviously the STIs and STDs, pelvic inflammatory disease, infertility. I've heard from a lot of healthcare providers that what hurts them the most is when they have to tell an 18-year-old girl that she's going to be infertile for the rest of her life because she's had all these untreated infections since she's been trafficked since she was 12. And that's very common. So we see a lot of infertility, fistulas, unwanted pregnancies, unsafe abortions, and general poor reproductive health. They are not kept healthy. So there's a lot of red flags you'll see if someone has been in the life. We talked about overdose and drug and alcohol addiction, psychological distress, the inability to access care. Again, they are only going to be seeking medical attention with the blessing of their trafficker if they are otherwise too unhealthy to work. They're not coming in for colds and other things like that. They are coming in when there is something that needs to be treated for them to go out and keep making money. So you'll see the signs of a lot of untreated stuff over the years when they do come in. And malnutrition is very, very common in both labor and sex trafficking. They haven't had access to sufficient food. We hear all the time that pimps only take the girls to McDonald's once a day, and they're only allowed to order, $5 worth of food off the menu. They have very insufficient nutrition, especially if they've been there, and working for a long time. And if they're starting when they're young, it's inhibiting their growth. I mean, these are kids, essentially. So you see that. There are a lot of specific injuries that are attached to the different areas in labor trafficking. So when we're talking about maybe not having good ventilation or sleep deprivation or working on heavy equipment that's unsafe, you see things like exhaustion, malnutrition, dehydration, repetitive motion syndromes and strains. Heat stroke is really common, especially working in the fields in summer. Any kind of repetitive syndrome from the action that needs to happen. Accident injuries, broken bones, severed fingers, that kind of stuff. Respiratory problems, depending on where they are. We see the respiratory problems a lot with women working in salons, with the fumes in the salons, because they are working incredibly long hours and not necessarily given the appropriate masking and ventilation. skin infections, gastrointestinal disease, all sorts of things. How many of you do forensic exams? SANE nurses, want to be SANE nurses, work with SANE nurses? All right, so I'm going to skip this, but I will say that SANE exams are an incredibly important point of contact for people in terms of collecting evidence for cases down the road. So that's really important for folks that are working with that. I want to leave you with some resources because, again, I know we're over time and this is the crash course. Lotus is a local program out of the Milwaukee area that actually can hook people up with attorneys for a number of different kinds of cases. So whether it is defense representation if someone is facing, let's say, prostitution charges that they shouldn't be because they're actually trafficking victims, immigration cases, family law cases because they share a child in common with their trafficker, Amber Alerts that you just saw the video from, they are based out of Fox Valley Tech, and they are the ones that actually do the national project, so they have a lot of good materials. Maybe you have a law enforcement department that could use a little training, hypothetically. They can come in with their team and train people. The Polaris Project is the hotline and a lot of that information. Wisconsin Department of Justice, my office, does have a whole lot of information on our website about trafficking. Breaking Free, I gave you some statistics from them out of the Twin Cities. They have some good information. But perhaps what's most important for a healthcare provider is Rescue and Restore. And if you go to the Rescue and Restore page, they actually have campaign toolkits. This piece of information is from Rescue and Restore, but they have a lot of lists specific to healthcare providers, red flags, questions to ask, all that kind of information. I don't want to bombard you with paper today, but it is available. They've got some good fact sheets online. If you run into someone, it is always still best practice to give this number to the individuals you've talked to, and you can call yourself. The national hotline has really been beefing up its list of Wisconsin resources more because the DOJ and some other folks are working on making sure the national group has the resources. So you can always refer people to the Family Center, and they have these resources as well, but you can have people call the national hotline or text. And most people actually choose to text, most victims text because it's easier. They can do it in the bathroom really fast and delete it. And you will get an instantaneous reaction from the hotline. Like, they aren't left hanging on. This is a 24/7 hotline. They've gotten a lot better. So if you ever think you've identified someone, this is still best practice. Any questions? Sorry, I know that was fast and furious without Paul Walker. All right, so everyone has my contact information. These slides are going to be provided to this gentleman in the back. I don't know where they're going. I can also, if anyone emails me, you have my contact information. I'm happy to send you the slides. I know this is a lot in a short amount of time, but thank you for coming. It's really important. Thank you.
Thanks.